Hello, guys. Welcome to Psyched Minds. If you have not subscribed yet, do subscribe, like, and share if you like. We are reading Why Has Nobody Told Me This Before by Dr. Julie Smith, Part 5, Chapter 20. You are not your mistakes. Most self doubt is linked to the relationship we have with failure. I am not about to sit here and tell you to just be okay with failures. Then everything will be easy. That is not true. Failure is never easy. It stings every time. We all want to be enough. We all want to be acceptable. And failure is a sign that maybe we weren't enough this time. It is not only our relationship with our own failures that needs to change, but also how we respond to the failure of others. You don't have to spend too long on Twitter to develop an overwhelming fear of failure. Say the wrong thing in a tweet, and a collective army of tweeters invade and hound you with verbal abuse, demanding you be pulled down from whatever heights you may have climbed in your lifetime. I have seen this happen to people who make simple mistakes in their use of language and immediately apologize for it. Given that social media is a magnified reflection of who we are as a society, this speaks so more likely to be this speaks to me about the intense shame we associate with any form of failure. Those who are highly self-critical are more likely to be critical of others. If we believe that mistakes and shortcomings should be met with humiliation and shame, no matter what the intention, how do we ever begin to be okay with taking risks and making mistakes ourselves? Something that has helped me a lot is understanding that how other people respond to my failures does not provide an accurate information assessment of my personality and worthiness as a human, but instead indicates how that person relates to failure. Accepting failures is hard in environments where people attack each other for mistakes. No matter how hostile we are towards failure collectively, changing our relationship with failure must begin with us. Failure hurts every time, whether the environment is safe or not. Therefore, we avoid it at all costs. We quit when things get hard. We switch to an easier, safer option, or we refuse to begin at all. All of those choices are addictive because they bring that blissful sense of relief. Phew, I don't have to face that today. We do that enough times and it becomes a pattern in our lives that keeps us stuck in a comfort zone that feels like terrible, with all its lethargy and lack of energy for anything. If the opposite of resisting failure is accepting it as a part of growth and learning, how do we do that? It is one thing to communicate something intellectually, it is quite another to feel it and truly believe it in the moment. Saying it is only useful if you can buy into it, belief is everything. So we need to say something that we can buy into. Therefore, it is no use trying to convince ourselves that it is safe to fail. We cannot guarantee how others will react. There will always be critics. Not everyone is going to help you up when you fail. Our only option is to commit wholeheartedly to doing that for ourselves. Start by recognizing that coming back from failures cannot be dependent on others. Using support that is available is always a good idea, but we cannot always count on someone else being there. So, committing to ourselves that we will take responsibility to tend to our wounds with compassion and dust ourselves off after a failure is essential if our resilience is not to be dependent on others doing that for us. Bouncing back from failure. 1.1 1. Recognizing the sensations in your body and signs in your urges and actions that indicate to you how you are feeling. If you find yourself using all of your favorite numbing activities, hours of TV, alcohol, or social media, the sting of failure drives us to block. So, even if you don't initially notice the feeling, you can notice the blocking behavior. Second, get unstuck. Remember the story about Jim Carrey removing the mask? It had less power over him when it was not right in front of his face. We can do this with emotion by seeing it as an experience washing over us, not as who we are. If you can label the emotion, it enables your mind to take a step back from it. If you can label the pattern of your thought, that will do the same thing. The account of what is going on, as told by your mind, is not a fact but a theory, opinion, story, or idea. That opinion is tinted with critical voices from your past and present, memories of feeling vulnerable or having failed. As we get to know the patterns of those critical voices and where they may have come from, we can even give that stream of thought a name. There is Helga giving her 2 cents. Doing this can be powerful at helping us to get some distance from the self attack and giving us more choice over whether we buy into it as factual or see it as just one very unhelpful option. 3. Notice the urges to block the painful feelings and keep reminding yourself that you do not have to act on those urges. When we stop fighting emotions but instead allow it to wash over us in all its might, it is painful and it is messy. But it also washes past. If we try to push it down and hold it under, it stays there, waiting for its chance to be processed. The opposite of blocking emotion is to be curious about it, move towards it, observe and notice the whole experience, all while doing step 4. 4 is soothe your way through and have your own back with the commitment of the best friend you could ever wish for. Be honest with yourself while also offering unconditional love and support. Wow, that was tough. Hold on. The best kind of friends know they cannot fix things for us, but they stand strong by our side through the whole thing. 5. Get learning. Anyone coaching a professional athlete will analyze each performance. They don't only look for what went wrong, they also look at what is working. So, when the pain of the setback has been calmed, get to work on making that experience useful for you. Don't neglect to notice the things you did well. Appreciate what worked and what didn't. Be your own coach so that you can learn from the experience and move forward. 6. Return to what matters. Failure and setbacks hurt every time, but dusting off and getting back out, they may still be in line with our values. When the pain of failure is still present, it can be difficult to even consider trying again. Instead, we want to run and hide. Coming back to your values and the reason you are doing this thing will help you make a decision based on your best interest and the life you want to have, rather than basing that decision purely on the pain. That being said, I don't want to trivialize just how much we can be overwhelmed with emotions after failure. So take your time. It is important to work through the experience first and try again when you are ready. We can also check out the chapter on values for more details, which is on page 284 in the later chapters. But in the heat of the moment, we don't always have time to wipe out our worksheets and double check what is in line with our values. In that moment, simply ask yourself, when I look back on this time, what choices would I be proud of? What actions could I take that I will be grateful I took a year from now? How can I learn from this and keep moving forward? That brings us to the end. Chapter summary. Most self doubt is linked to the relationship we have with failure. How other people respond to your failure does not say anything about your own personality or worthiness. The sting of failure can drive us to numb or block emotion. So, even if you don't initially notice the feeling, you can notice the blocking behavior. Be your own coach and turn failure into a learning experience as you keep moving forward in line with what matters most to you. The emotional response to failure can be overwhelming, so take your time. Chapter 21. Being enough. The brick wall that most people hit on their way to self acceptance is the misconception that it will cause laziness and complacency. They think that self acceptance means believing you are okay just as you are. Therefore, you will have no motivation for improvement, work, achievement, or change. In reality, the research shows us that those who develop self acceptance and learn to be self compassionate are less likely to fear failure, more likely to persevere and try again when they do fail, and generally have more self confidence. Neff et al. 2005. Self acceptance and the compassion we show ourselves when we are accepting of the self is not the same as becoming indifferent to the world and passively resigning yourself to accept defeat when things are tough. Having unconditional love for yourself means doing the opposite sometimes. It can mean taking the more difficult road because it is in your best interests. It is refusing to kick yourself while you are down or indulging in self loathing and instead using every ounce of strength to pull yourself back up after a fall. The difference is that when you strive, you do so from a place of love and contentment rather than striving from a place of fear and scarcity. If we don't do the work to develop self acceptance, we set ourselves up to live a life in which we may need constant reassurance, get trapped in jobs we hate or relationships that cause us harm, or find ourselves living with resentment. So, how do we start developing self acceptance? Understanding yourself. Sounds simple, but many people go through life without much in the way of examining their own patterns of behavior that impact on their experience of life. To build self acceptance, we first need to understand who we are and who we want to be. That comes from practicing self awareness. We become self aware through self reflection. Keeping journals, going to a therapist, or talking to friends can all help us to reflect on ourselves and our experience in a way that enables us to learn more about who we are and why we do what we do. Self acceptance involves listening to our own needs and meeting them. If we are not paying attention, we don't always pick up on the signs. During that process, it is important to be attentive to the parts of us that we feel proud of and the parts of us that we may prefer not to think about. The things we dislike, feel anxious or regretful about, or want to change. But when we do reflect on those more difficult aspects of the self, it is crucial that we come at it with the compassion of an observer if we are to learn. If reflecting on difficult situation triggers intense emotions that make it harder to think clearly, it can be helpful to get support from a therapist to help us work through it. Painting the picture of self acceptance. Let's say that from the moment you closed this book, you started living your life with unconditional self acceptance. What would that look like? What would you do differently? What would you say yes or no to? What would you say no to? What would you work hard on? What would you let go? How would you speak to yourself? How would you speak to others? Try writing down your answers to those questions in great detail and create a vision of how the idea of self acceptance would translate into behavioral change for you. As with most changes, the action comes first and the feelings come later. So, living a life in which you feel a sense of self worth means making it a life practice. The work is never done. You never arrive. You do the work every day to live in line with unconditional self acceptance. Accepting all of you. While you maintain a sense of self that stays with you throughout your life, you also experience a wide range of emotional states that are constantly in motion, changing from one moment to the next. We take on different roles and behaviors in different scenarios, and many people see those as different parts of themselves. Depending on our early life experiences and how the world responded to those emotion states, we can feel that some parts of the self are less acceptable than others. If anger was unacceptable for you growing up, then it might feel much harder to treat yourself with compassion and acceptance when you are feeling angry. This makes self acceptance conditional on how you feel. Try this. You can build your awareness of how you respond to various emotions and practice stepping back from them and responding to them with compassion using the following exercise that is used in compassion focused therapy or CFT, Irons and Beaumont, 2017. So, spend a few moments thinking back to a recent event that triggered a mix of emotions. It is a good idea to start with something that is not too distressing so that you don't become overwhelmed while trying to practice this exercise. One, write down a few thoughts about the event. Two, write down the different emotion it brought up. For example, anger, sadness, anxiety. For each emotion that you identify, take a one at a time, connect with that feeling, and explore your answer to the following questions. Where do you notice that feeling in your body? How did you know that feeling was there? Which of your thoughts were linked to that feeling? If that emotion could speak, what would it say? What urges came along with that feeling? If that emotion had been able to decide the outcome, what would it have made you do? For example, anxiety may have wanted you to run away, anger may have wanted you to shout at someone. 4. What does that part of you need? What would help that emotion to come back down, to calm? Once you have done this for each emotion that was present, end by answering the questions for you, compassionate self, the part of you that wants to show yourself unconditional love and acceptance. As you do this for each emotion, give yourself time to step back from connecting with an emotion before stepping into the next one. If there were lots of mixed emotions, each time you do this, you are strengthening the ability to diffuse those emotions and get a good understanding of them without getting overwhelmed by them. This can be a helpful exercise for examining those mixed emotions, allowing us to see that even those emotions that we once saw as unacceptable are just normal. Each reflects a different way of interpreting the situation. So we can come to different conclusions about which direction to take next. Taking time to get a bird's eye view of emotional experience like this can help us to engage with our compassion, even in situations where we have been taught to be harsh on ourselves. Kicking self criticism. What does your self criticism sound like? What words do you use? What does it focus on? What types of things do you criticize yourself for? Appearance, performance, personality traits, comparison? Certain forms of self criticism can be more damaging than others. Sometimes self criticism can take the form of telling yourself that you are inadequate after a failure. But when it goes further than that and you feel a sense of disgust and hate towards yourself, it is even more pervasive and shaming. Try this. This is a quick exercise that can help us get some distance from your inner critic and see it for what it is. Once you have reflected on all the different ways you criticize yourself, take a moment to imagine that critic as a person outside your own head. What would they look like? What would their facial expression and tone of voice be as they spoke to you? What emotions would they be expressing? How does it feel how does it feel to have them in front of you? What do you think might be their intention? Is this a misguided attempt to protect you in some way? Is this someone you would want to spend time with? Is this someone who could help you live a happy life? And finally, ask yourself, what is the impact of spending every hour of every day with that critic? Finding your compassionate side. When your inner critic has been a close but unwanted companion for most of your life, it is almost impossible to simply decide to remove them. That well practiced action means those neutral pathways are easily accessible for your brain, so that voice will speak up from time to time. What we need to do is provide ourselves with a new, healthier, and more helpful voice and then start practicing. In the same way that you made time to see and hear the inner critic, let's invite that compassionate side of you to the party. The side that wants the best for you and recognizes the harm that the self attack causes. That part of you still wants you to grow and achieve, but from a place of love rather than shame. Take some time to consider what compassionate self talk might sound like. Remember, this is not the same as positive thinking. Someone who has compassion is honest and kind, encouraging and supportive, and wants the best for you. What words would you use when showing compassion to others? What words of compassion have others expressed to you? Bring to mind a memory of a time with someone showing you compassion. How did they look at you? What did they say? How did that make you feel? What would it be like to have access to that voice at any time? Try this. To strengthen our compassionate side, we simply have to put in some reps on a regular basis and practice. Try writing a compassionate letter to yourself. Allow yourself to write spontaneously in the way you might write to a close friend who was suffering or trying their best to change. How would you express to them that you had their back and always wished for their suffering to ease? Nobody needs to read the letter, but the process of engaging with your compassionate self and thinking through the various ways you can express that helps you to build that mental muscle, to use it when you most need it. If you find yourself struggling to access that feeling of compassion for yourself, focus on someone that you love unconditionally and imagine you are writing to them, or use the words that loved ones have said to you in the past. That brings us to the end. Chapter summary is: there is a misconception that self acceptance will cause laziness, complacency, and lack of drive. In reality, the research shows that those who develop self acceptance and learn to be self compassionate are less likely to fear failure and more likely to try again when they do fail. Self acceptance is not the same as passively accepting defeat. Self compassion often involves taking the more difficult road that is in your best interest. Chapter 21 of part 6. We are on part 6 now. Make anxiety disappear. Okay. For as long as I can remember, I have had a fear of heights. For the most part, I was able to avoid them growing up, but when I met my now husband, we went on trip to Italy together. We went to visit the leaning towers of Pisa, and as we stood looking at it, he held out two tickets. We were going to the top. A deep intake of breath was followed by another glance up at the tower that leans at 3.99 degrees and looks worryingly close to falling over. My heart started to beat against my ribcage and I felt sick. But the tickets were bought, so up we went. To get to the top of the leaning tower of Pisa, you climb the narrow stone steps that spiral around inside the tower. The ground beneath your feet is not level, and as you scale the tower, you get the sensation that it is starting to fall over. At least that was my assessment at the time. With a queue of people behind me, I kept going. Once at the top, the tilt feels even worse. Everyone walked straight over to the edge to take up the view. I had the overwhelming urge to get closer to the ground. I moved as far away from the edge as I could get and dropped to the ground. There was a vague attempt to make it look like I was just sitting down casually to have a rest, but by now my fear of embarrassment was outweighed by my fear of falling to my death. Of course, sitting on the floor made me no safer, but it was not based on logic. My brain was sending out strong signals to the rest of my body to get down. I even found myself looking down at the slab of stone to avoid looking out at the view. Matthew took a picture of me crouching on the floor, and we now have a funny memory to look back. But what was going on at that moment? Why did I have the urge to get on the floor? My phobia, learned early in childhood, meant that the moment I saw those tickets and imagined climbing to the top of the tower, my body reacted. My heart started beating faster, my breathing became shallow and fast, my palms sweaty. The building being off balance only contributed to my predictions that I would fall to my death at any moment. But the brain's alarm system, which was sounding and telling me to get to safety, is more like a smoke alarm. It doesn't have time to take account of all the facts. Its job is to sense the danger and let me know. It takes the information from the distress signals in my body, information from my surroundings, from my senses, and pieces that together with memories of what was happening when I last felt this way. In the same way that a smoke alarm can go off when there is a fire, it can also go off when someone is making the toast. The strong urge to drop to the ground was a suggestion from my brain that my body took very seriously. Much to the amusement of everyone else on the tower, the fear was overwhelming. So I did the first thing I could think of to feel safer. I wanted the fear to go away. Those strong urges to get to safety are not at fault, but the brain working at its best to keep us safe. Crucially, my actions did not make me any safer, but just helped me to feel safer. The question of how to make anxiety go away might be one of the most common questions I receive. It makes sense to ask that. Anxiety is uncomfortable at times, at best, overwhelming at worst. When you feel anxious, your body is working really hard, so it's also exhausting. Nobody wants to live with anxiety every day. Here is where I went wrong on the Leaning Tower of Pisa and did very little to help my fear of heights. I avoided the fear as much as I could. I got close to the ground. I avoided looking out at the view. I even shut my eyes even when I could. I tried to convince myself that I was not up high. I left the tower before my fear had left me. As my feet hit the comforting grass of the field of dreams once again, I felt a rush of relief and my body immediately calmed. My brain said, "Phew, that was dangerous. Let's never do that again." I did everything I could to make that fear go away as soon as possible. But all the things that give us that instant relief tend to keep us stuck in that long term. If I knew then what I know now, and I was on that trip to tackle my fear of heights, here's what I would have done. I would have gone to the top of the tower and looked out at the view. The feelings would all have been the same, but this time I would allow it to be present without trying to avoid it. I would have responded to them by taking control of my breathing, and I would have focused on breathing slowly. I would have reminded myself that my body and brain were responding in this way because I have memories of being up high and feeling unsafe as a child. I would have reminded myself repeatedly that I was in fact safe. I would turn my attention to why I was there, and I would continue to breathe slowly for however long it took for my body to exhaust itself. When my fear started to subside and my body calmed, only then would I step down again. I would then repeat that pattern for as many days as possible, knowing that over time my body would habituate to the situation and my fear response would gradually reduce in its intensity. Fear is a part of our survival response. It is supposed to be intensely uncomfortable, and the urges to escape and then avoid the feared situation are supposed to be strong. If we are in a survival situation, that system works incredibly well to keep us safe. That moment you are crossing the road and you hear a car horn too close. Before you can even think about the situation, you dash to the curb quicker than you ever thought you could move. Then you feel the surge of adrenaline wash over your entire body. That is your fear response working at its best. But a system that works that fast does not have time to contemplate what signs are valid and which ones might be less reliable signs of danger. It senses, it acts. You survive. Thank you, brain. In other situations, when your life is not in danger, the urges are still the same. You are asked to speak in a meeting and your heart starts pounding. Your heart may be getting your body ready to be alert and perform, but if you interpret that as fear and make your excuses to leave the room, then avoid those meetings in the future. You never get to experience talking in meetings and having it go well. The things that give us immediate relief from our fear tend to feed that fear in the long term. Every time we say no to something because of fear, we reconfirm our belief that it wasn't safe or that we couldn't handle it. Every time we cut something out of our lives because of fear, life shrinks a little. So our efforts to get rid of fear today means that fear gets to take over our life choices in the long run. Our attempt to control fear and eliminate it becomes the real problem that dictates our every move. Fear is around every turn, in every novel situation we face, in every creative endeavor, and every learning experience. If we are unwilling to experience it, what are we left with? That's true. Chapter summary. It is understandable to want anxiety to disappear. It is supposed to be uncomfortable To fight fear, you must first be willing to face it. Escape and avoidance only provides short term relief but feeds anxiety in the long run. Our attempt to control fear and eliminate it becomes the real problem that dictates our every move. A threat response needs to work fast, so it tends to sound the alarm before you have a chance to think things through in more detail. Next chapter, chapter 23 of part 6, things we do that make anxiety worse. When we feel anxious about something, the most natural human response is to avoid it. We know that if we stay away, we'll feel safe for now. But avoidance not only maintains the anxiety, it makes it worse over time. Your brain learns like a scientist. Each time it has an experience, positive or negative, it clocks that as evidence for its belief. If you avoid the thing you fear, you never give yourself the chance to build up evidence in your mind that you can get through it and survive. Just telling your brain that something is safe is not enough. You must experience it. Your brain will take some convincing, so you need to repeat that behavior over and over as many times as it takes. The things you do most of the time becomes your comfort zone. So if you want to feel less anxious about something, do it as often as you can. Use the skills to help you sit with the anxiety and it will reduce over time. When we learn to face the things that make us feel afraid, we get stronger. When we do that day after day, over time we develop a sense of growth. Imagine if over the next 5 years you made your decisions based on the life you want to have instead of fear. We avoid the discomfort of fear in so many ways. If you feel anxious about a social event, you may avoid it by not going. Or maybe you do go, but you drink to excess before you go. Drinking may dampen that anxiety in the moment, leaving you feeling the need to do the same as the next social event at the next social event. These safety behaviors work in the same way to numb the anxiety in the moment, but they don't help us to feel less afraid in the future. In fact, they do the opposite. They feed the anxiety for the future and we become dependent on using those safety behavior, making life even harder. Here is a list of some common safety behaviors that ease anxiety in the moment but keep us stuck in the long term. Escape. Whether it be a social situation, the supermarket, or a confined space, when anxiety hits, we have the urge to get out of there as quickly as possible. Then, anxious avoidance. The moment you say no to that invitation to avoid the social situation or opt for food deliverance to avoid the anxious feeling you get in the supermarket, you are rewarded with instant relief. Phew, I don't have to face that feeling today. But the longer you stay away from something, the more the fear seems to grow. Then the day comes that you need to face it once again and it now feels overwhelming. Compensatory strategy. This can happen after experiencing a high anxiety state. For example, someone with a fear of contamination or sickness may wash excessively after being in a hospital setting. Anticipation, also called sensitization. This is when we rehearse and anticipate various worst case scenarios that may occur in a feared situation. We are often convinced that it is helping because it will protect us if we are prepared, but it can lead to hypervigilance and excessive worry, constructive planning without constructive planning, which leads to increased anxiety. Reassurance seeking. In moments of anxiety and doubt, we may ask for reassurance from a loved one that everything will be okay. It is hard to see a loved one in distress, so they are often more than willing to use reassurance to help calm the anxiety. But over time, that instant relief can become addictive, and we develop a dependency on that other person. We may need almost constant reassurance or feel unable to leave the house without being accompanied by the person who makes us feel safe, which can weigh heavily on a relationship. Safety behaviors. We can also come to rely on things that we associate with safety if we don't trust ourselves to be able to cope with anxiety hits. We may feel unable to go anywhere without just in case medications, or we take a mobile phone everywhere because looking down at it enables us to avoid conversations at social events. That brings us to the end of our chapter summary. When we feel anxious about something, the most natural human response is to avoid it. But avoidance maintains anxiety. Just telling your brain that something is safe is not enough. You must experience it to truly believe it. Your brain will take some convincing, so you need to repeat that behavior over and over again. The things you do most often becomes your comfort zone. If you want to feel less anxious about something, do it as often as you can. Then we will continue with chapter 24, which is again short, but let's continue with chapter 24 in our next reading. We are on part 6 now. If you have any doubts, any questions regarding the content we just read or previous contents that I have read or anything at all, you can reach out in the comment section of the video you're viewing or in the community section of the YouTube channel. If you have not subscribed, do subscribe, like and share if you like. If you have anything at all, you can reach out. If you want to check out the other videos, which I would recommend that you do, please check out it from the playlist section of the YouTube channel. And yeah, bye bye. Take care, keep reading, and bye.